so. Okay. So again, this is session 7, chapters 19 to 20, Solomon and the temple. And again, I'm just opening up with some scriptures regarding the land of Israel and the promise to the Jewish people. 1 Kings 8:22, then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands towards heaven. Verses 33 to 34. When your people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against you, if they turn to you again and confess your name and pray and make supplication to you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them back to the land which you gave to their fathers. 1 Kings 8:36, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants and of your people Israel. Indeed, teach them the good way in which they should walk, and send rain on your land, which you have given your people for an inheritance. And 1 Kings 8:40, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land which you have given to our fathers. And then 2 Kings 21:8, and I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers, if only they will observe to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. 1 Chronicles 16:13 to 18, O seed of Israel, his servant, sons of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. Remember his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations. And this is just a comment. The covenant which he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac, he also confirmed to Jacob for a statute to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as a portion of your inheritance. 2 Chronicles 6:25, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them back to the land which you have given to them and to their fathers. 2 Chronicles 6:27, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants and your people Israel. Indeed, teach them the good way in which they should walk, and send rain on your land, which you have given to your people for an inheritance. In 2 Chronicles 6:38, if they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their captivity, where they have been taken captive, and pray toward their land which you have given to their father, and the city which you have chosen, and toward the house which I have built for your name, then I will uproot you. And then, I'm sorry, 2 Chronicles 7:20, then I will uproot you from my land which I have given you. Again, if they, again, God warned them that to dwell in the land was a privilege, and if they wandered and turned their back on him, as we'll see as we're going through this course, that they will end up being scattered, but then regathered. 2 Chronicles 30:8, and I will not again remove the foot of Israel from the land which I have appointed for your fathers, if they will only observe to do all that I have commanded them, according to all the law, the statutes, and the ordinances given through Moses. So under Solomon's rule, David and Solomon, all of Israel was united, but we'll see as we go forward that didn't last very long, only because of, again, their faithlessness to the covenant. So I'm going to play, let's see. Okay. Again, this is a picture of Solomon's temple here. And this is, again, this little video goes over Solomon, the richest man that ever lived. going to go to the next one now.
David conquered Jerusalem and made it the capital of all the tribes of Israel. But it was in the time of Solomon that Jerusalem acquired the status of a perfect city. Solomon's name comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace and completeness. Most often, Bible scholars portray Solomon as the figure who built the temple of God of Israel. But the temple is just a crown on the head of mighty construction projects that show this legendary king's glory and wisdom. I invite you to the next episode of the History of Jerusalem, in which we will present the profile of the third king of Israel. At the same time, do not forget to subscribe to this channel to receive notifications about the next episodes on YouTube. At the end of today's episode, you will have a chance to see Solomon's Jerusalem in 3D. So let's begin. If ever there was a man who had everything the human heart could desire, it was Solomon. Most importantly, he had wisdom, which he received from God himself. This wisdom allowed him to write 3,000 parables and 1,005 songs. For comparison, Mozart wrote 626 pieces, which is considered an extraordinary result, as it means that he wrote about 18 songs during the year. Solomon is believed to be the author of many psalms, parables, and Ecclesiastes that we find in the Bible. Of course, we read that Solomon was famous in the ancient world. The rulers of other countries made pilgrimages to Jerusalem to primarily listen to Solomon's wisdom. What else Solomon had? Wealth that stood out even from such powers like Egypt or Assyria. During his reign, we read that he received 25 tons of gold for each of the 39 years of his rules, which in 2021 would be worth billions of dollars. Combined with the impossible riches amassed from taxes and commerce, the biblical ruler's fortune could exceed $2 trillion. Making today's officially richest man in the world, Elon Musk, with net worth of $185 billion, ridiculous. And so Solomon was about 1,000 times richer than Elon Musk. In the Bible, we read that Solomon had so much gold that silver was not considered even a precious material. Recent archaeological research shows that many of the mines found in the Timnah National Park were used during Solomon's time. Today, Timnah National Park is a nice place to visit, to hike in the south of Israel. I really enjoyed it when I visited. I can't also not mention 700 wives and 300 concubines that Solomon had, and were certainly a proof of his power. Of course, women in ancient times were often treated as trophies and a way of making favorable political deals with other rulers. The only wife named is Naamah the Amorite, mother of Solomon's successor, Rehoboam. The most visible evidence of the uniqueness of Solomon's time were, of course, the building projects in Jerusalem. During his reign, Solomon built the forest of the house of Lebanon, the column hall, the throne room, the royal palace, the court, and of course, the legendary temple. As promised, at the end of this episode, I invite you to a virtual tour of Solomon's Jerusalem. The territory ruled by Solomon included the land that God had promised Abraham. David began the work of uniting all the tribes of Israel into one integral political unit. Through the perfect sense of a warrior, David conquered large areas, enlarging the borders of Israel. Yet it was Solomon again who completed the work and compiled all the territories promised to Jacob's descendants. Therefore, the period of Solomon's reign can be described as the golden age of Israel history. Never in history did Israel attain the status that Solomon had earned. Some even believe that Solomon's kingdom is a picture of the promised messianic era in which the Messiah will re-sit on the throne of David, will reign in Jerusalem over the whole world, and people from many countries will make pilgrimages to Israel to admire his wisdom and majesty. After the fall of Israel, many prophets announced that such a time will come, and the glory of God will return to the Lord's sanctuary on Zion. What distinguishes Solomon from the king's Messiah is the apparent weakness that David's son exhibits later in his life. The biblical narrative notes with disapproval that Solomon allowed his foreign wives to import their national deities by building the temples to them. Such behavior leads to idolatry and the division of the kingdom after the death of the monarch. Therefore, he is not the perfect ruler who is to rule forever on the throne of David. If you are looking for a depressing book, well, try Ecclesiastes, written by Solomon or a person representing his character and positions. As we mentioned, Solomon had everything you can imagine: wisdom, power, fame, wealth, woman, and peace. And yet in the book, Solomon writes that everything we achieve in this life is worthless. Solomon had everything that this life could offer, and yet he found no satisfaction. Perhaps it is a lesson for us in a world where we often follow the things that we think will bring us happiness. But do they really? I find the story of Solomon fascinating. Few question Solomon's existence as a king of Israel, but many doubt that his kingdom was as spectacular as the Bible describes. For centuries, no historical evidence of the structures described in the Bible was found in Jerusalem. Of course, you must remember that Jerusalem was conquered and destroyed dozens of times, so there could not be much left from Solomon's period, that is the 10th century BC. But still, we should find something. The breakthrough was the archaeological work led by Eliad Mazar, who in 2010 announced the discovery of the parts of the ancient walls around the city of David, which she believes date back to the 10th century BC. According to Mazar, this is the most significant structure we have from the first temple period in Israel. And this means that at this time in the 10th century, there was a regime in Jerusalem capable of making such a construction. The section of the wall is approximately 70 meters long and 6 meters high, and it is located in the area known as Ophel, between the city of David and the south wall of Jerusalem's Temple Mount. Additionally to the wall, Mazar discovered the inner gate leading to the royal quarter of the city, a royal building connected to the gate, and a corner tower that overlooks much of the Kidron Valley. Here you can see a 3D model that was created by me based on the archaeological findings. I hope it helps you to imagine this place.
I'm going to skip over to the end here where he gives you the 3D tour, because we're going to cover, a lot of what he's talking about too. This is a 3D of Solomon's Jerusalem. This was shown in the first video, but it's good to see it again. And this is his palace area he's showing. This being the temple area. Okay, so that'll give you kind of a visual. I like using visuals if I could find them that are applicable to what we are studying. So again, we're looking at the reign of King Solomon, and I'm using both Joseph Telushkin, Rabbi Telushkin, and also Rabbi Spiro's, as well as commentaries. Solomon commences his reign with a tremendous advantage. His father's battles have bequeathed to him the largest and securest kingdom in Jewish history. Again, this is why David couldn't build the temple, because he was a man of war and again secured the kingdom that the father had given Israel. As a result, he has the time to focus on intellectual pursuits and building projects. It is Solomon who builds the first Beit HaMikdash, or Great Temple, which survives until 586 BCE, which is before the Common Era. Unfortunately, as brilliant as he is in some areas, is Solomon unwise in others. To raise the funds needed to build the temple, he imposes exceptionally high taxes, then drafts 10,000 Israelites a month for forced labor in Lebanon to pay for the raw materials he has purchased there. Then again, in the video, we shared what they estimated, his net worth was. again, in billions and trillions of dollars. This combination of high taxes and forced labor, particularly among a people whose bitterest memories were of slavery in Egypt, causes considerable resentment, especially when the emergency taxes continue to be levied even after the temple is built. Again, this is Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, Jewish Literacy. Unfortunately, as brilliant as he is in some areas, again, I'm sorry, that's a repetition there. Solomon was also the most polygamous Jew in history. The Bible claims that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So you're looking at, 1,000 women. Many, if not most of the wives were foreign women of noble birth whom he married in order to secure good diplomatic relations with their native lands, which was a common practice back then. In the Middle East and, in other countries. Unfortunately, however, instead of influencing his non-Jewish wives to become monotheists, they compromised his own religiosity. Of the very king responsible for building the magnificent Beit HaMikdash, the Bible observes, he was not as wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord as his father David had been. Solomon apparently even built idolatrous temples so that his non-Jewish wives would have places to worship. This is from Ken Spiro, Crash Course in Jewish History. Again, before David died, he appointed as king his 12-year-old son Solomon with these words, I go the way of all the earth. You shall be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man and keep the charge of the Lord your God to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. This classic blessing is often quoted by fathers to their sons on the day of their bar mitzvah. It restates the cardinal rule that has guided the Jewish people since the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. In order to prosper, keep Torah. Shortly after Solomon was anointed king, God appeared to him in a dream in which he invited Solomon to make a request for himself. Solomon answered, I am but a small child. Give therefore your servant an understanding heart to judge your people. His request pleased God, who told him, because you have not requested riches and honor, but only that which would benefit all the people, I will give you not only an understanding heart like none other before or after you, but also riches and honor like no other king in your days. Born in 848 BCE, Solomon died at age 52 in 796 BCE. Ruling as king for 40 years of peace and prosperity, the best years in all of Israel's history. During his reign, he was known as the wisest of all the men. The Bible relates that kings from all over the world came to hear his wisdom, which included not only Torah wisdom, but also wisdom and secular knowledge and science. So again, the father, truly blessed Solomon in every way, and a person can be blessed. His fame spread through all the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 parables and 1,005 poems. He discoursed about trees from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows from the wall. He also discoursed about animals, birds, creeping things, and fish. Men of all nations came to hear Solomon's wisdom, as did all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. One of those who came as a much celebrated visit was the Queen of Sheba, who wished to test the king with her most difficult questions. Which was she so curious about? The Jewish tradition relates that she had come armed with provocative riddles, one of which went like this. A woman said to her son, your father is my father. Your grandfather is my husband. You are my son, and I am your sister. Who am I? King Solomon promptly answered, a daughter of Lot, who together with their father tried to repopulate the world after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The queen went home highly impressed with the king and his kingdom. And we know by tradition that he had a child with the Queen of Sheba, which the Ethiopian Jews trace themselves back to. Solomon made one serious mistake. In violation of Torah's prohibition, he took too many wives. In fact, again, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. If we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, where the idea of a Jewish king is first discussed, Moshe warns that the king should not have too many horses nor too many wives. The great 11th century Torah commentator Rashi tells us that this means no more than 18 and that King David had only 6. The Torah places limits on the number of wives and the amount of wealth the king can have to ensure that he stays focused on his responsibilities and does not get distracted and corrupted by materialism and power. Again, that, God allowed this, more than one wife, but it was never the original plan, and it's not his plan now, because as we see through scriptures, there was always problems. And, I feel sorry, I was thinking about these women here. There's like 1,000 women who are, pretty much, well taken care of by this king, but they never, were allowed to, find their own, quote, true love, have, many of them had children by Solomon, but what kind of life is that? That had to be, even though they lived in wealth and were well taken care of, that had to be a very lonely life for these women. Solomon was certainly aware of these prohibitions, but felt that his great wisdom and spirituality would enable him to handle these challenges and be an even greater king. Unfortunately, he did not foresee the problems that some of these many foreign wives would cause. Again, he allowed, during this time, allowed the flesh to rule him, when his father David warned him, to follow the Torah and keep his eyes on the Torah. So even though he was, considered the wisest man in the whole earth, he did not use much wisdom when it came to, again, his flesh and his, earthly choices when it came to women. Again, why did Solomon need so many wives? The answer has nothing to do with love. Throughout history, the overwhelming reason for marriage among nobility and royalty was to create political alliances. The Middle East in Solomon's time was made up of many city-states, and all the kings of these city-states wanted to send their daughters to marry Solomon, and in this way form an alliance with him. Solomon himself had an additional reason. His marriages to these foreign wives were his way of bringing these nations closer to God. Obviously, the foreign wives were required to convert to Judaism. Now, the motivation to convert should come solely out of a love of truth and sincere desire to join the Jewish people, despite the tremendous obligations that a Jewish lifestyle entails and external dangers that the Jewish people have always faced. In short, the prospective convert must demonstrate total commitment in spite of any difficulties or dangers. The reigns of David and Solomon were unique, idyllic periods when the Jewish people enjoyed peace, prosperity, and a unique leadership among the nations. During these periods, there were many who wished to convert not out of a desire for truth, but rather for a personal benefit. So again, it wasn't a commitment out of love for the God of Israel to truly want to be one of his people. It was, again, for convenience, for personal benefit. Such insincere conversions were not accepted, and the Talmud states that during this time, all conversions were suspended. However, an exception was made for the wives of the king, and a special court was set up to handle their conversions. It is certain that despite claims to the contrary, not all of Solomon's wives completely abandoned their idolatrous practices. One of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people, a man of the highest spiritual level who wrote the Song of Songs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Proverbs, must be suffering eternal pain knowing what has been written about him in the Bible. Not only is criticism of Solomon harsh, but as with other great Jewish leaders, so are the consequences of his mistakes. The Bible ends Solomon's story relating that God was angry with him and told him, "Since you are guilty of this and you have not kept my covenant and my laws, I will tear the kingdom away from you. But I will not do this in your time for the sake of your father David. Instead, I will tear it away from your son, but I will give your son one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. It is clear from this how much God loved King David and how completely he had forgiven him for his faults. It is also clear that hard times are coming for the Jewish people as the kingdom of Israel is about to be torn in half. So again, we learn, from history, the cost of not being obedient to what God tells you to do, especially in leadership. It cost Israel, again, their peace, their prosperity, their unity. God allowed Solomon to fulfill his reign, but after his reign had ended, again, the kingdom will split, and we will see that. And these wives also influenced him. So here he built this beautiful holy temple, but at the same time, he allowed these pagan temples to be built as well, again, trying to please these wives of his, again, showing, a lack of, spiritual commitment and, again, weakness in the flesh as a leader, even though he is still spoken well of for all he's done. This was a huge mistake, and that God is a God of justice. And again, he, who knows how it could have been if, Solomon had been obedient and didn't do what he did, but again, we see that it happened and the kingdom is split. And again, there's strife and warfare ensues. The temple, the crowning achievement of King Solomon's reign, was the erection, this is Joseph Teluskin, of a magnificent temple, again, Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem. His father, King David, had wanted to build a great temple for God a generation earlier as a permanent resting place for the ark containing the 10 Commandments, a divine edict, however, had forbidden him from doing so. Again, 1 Chronicles 28:3, you will not build a house for my name, God said to him, for you are a man of battles and have shed blood. The Bible's description of Solomon's temple suggests that it was 180 feet long, 90 feet wide, and 50 feet high. He spares no expense in the building's creation. He orders vast quantities of cedar from King Hiram of Tyre, 1 Kings 5:20-25. Has huge blocks of the choicest stone quarried and commands that the building's foundation be laid with hewn stone. To complete the massive project, he imposes forced labor on all his subjects, drafting people for work shifts lasting a month at a time. Some 3,300 officials are appointed to oversee the temple's erection. We see that in 1 Kings 5:27-30. Solomon assumed such heavy debts in building the kingdom that he is forced to pay off King Hiram with 20 towns in the Galilee, 1 Kings 9:11. When the temple is completed, Solomon inaugurates it with prayer and sacrifice and even invites non-Jews to come and pray there. He urges God to pay particular heed to their prayers. Thus, all the peoples of the earth will know your name and revere you, as does your people Israel, and they will recognize that your name is attached to this house that I have built. 1 Kings 8:43. Until the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians some 400 years later in 586 BCE, sacrifice was the predominant mode of divine service there. 70 years after, a second temple was built on the same site, and sacrifices again resumed. During the 1st century BCE, Herod greatly enlarged and expanded this temple. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE after the failure of the Great Revolt. And I had shown a picture before. I had a diagram comparing the Mishkan in the wilderness to Solomon's temple, then Herod's temple. And again, the tabernacle in the wilderness was again very modest compared to, again, Solomon's, and the one that Herod again really rebuilding and enlarging it even more. I mean, it just got bigger and bigger each time. As glorious and as elaborate as the temple was, its most important room contained almost no furniture at all. known as the Holy of Holies, or Kodashim. It housed the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. Unfortunately, the tablets disappeared when the Babylonians destroyed the temple and during the Second Temple era. The Holy of Holies was a small, entirely bare room, and only once a year on Yom Kippur, the high priest would enter this room and pray to God on Israel's behalf. A remarkable monologue by a Hasidic rabbi in the Yiddish play, the Dibuk, conveys a sense of what the Jewish throngs worshiping the temple must have experienced during this ceremony. God's world is great and holy. The holiest land in the world is the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, the holiest city is Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, the holiest place was the temple, and in the temple, the holiest spot was the Holy of Holies. There are 70 peoples in the world, or 70 nations. The holiest among those is the people of Israel. The holiest of the people of Israel is the tribe of Levi. In the tribe of Levi, the holiest are the priests. Among the priests, the holiest was the high priest. There are 354 days in the lunar year. Among these, the holidays are holy. Higher than these is the holiness of the Sabbath. Among Sabbaths, the holiest is the Day of Atonement, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. There are 70 languages in the world. The holiest is Hebrew. Holier than all else in this language is the Holy Torah, and in the Torah, the holiest part is the 10 Commandments. In the 10 Commandments, the holiest of all words is the name of God. And once during the year, at a certain hour, these 4 supreme sanctities of the world were joined with one another. That was on the Day of Atonement. Atonement, when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies and there utter the name of God. And because this hour was beyond measure, holy and awesome, it was a time of utmost peril, not only for the high priest, but for the whole of Israel. For if in this hour there had, God forbid, entered the mind of the high priest a false or sinful thought, the entire world would have been destroyed. To this day, Orthodox Jews pray 3 times a day for the temple's restoration. During the centuries, the Muslims controlled Palestine. 2 mosques were built on the site of the Jewish temple. This was no coincidence. It has been common Islamic practice to build mosques on the sites of other people's holy places. Since any attempt to level these mosques would lead to an international Muslim holy war, jihad against Israel, the temple cannot be rebuilt in the foreseeable future. Again, there's the Temple Institute in Israel, and they are preparing for the 3rd temple. Again, they have the artifacts, they have the priestly garments, they have the menorah, they have all the holy utensils. Everything is ready, except the temple itself, which according to prophecy, according to the word, it will be rebuilt prior to the tribulation period. The crowning achievement of Solomon's reign was the building of the temple, which his father, again, King David, had dreamt about. The Bible devotes several chapters to the construction of this most important building to the nation of Israel, the place of communion between man and God. It says that the entire temple, both inside and outside, including floors and doors, were overlaid with gold. Besides this, there were bronze structures such as columns, an immersion tank, and basins. This magnificent edifice took 7 years to build. When it is finished, again, Solomon dedicated the temple with this prayer to God: "Behold the heaven, and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have regard for the prayer of your servant and for his supplication. Lord my God, listen to the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you today, that your eyes may be open toward this house day and night, toward the place with which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer of your people Israel." This was the pinnacle of Solomon's reign and of Jewish history. Everyone was united. Their neighbors didn't bother the Jews. In fact, they came to learn from them. There was peace and prosperity, and this was as good as it ever would get for Israel, the closest that it came to achieving the idea of creating a nation that is a light to the nations. This was the zenith, so why didn't it last? Again, this is Ken Spiro's commentary. So now we are getting into the divided kingdom, where Judah and Ephraim are split in two. Although at the time of King Solomon's death in 796 BCE, Israel was still a united country. There was already some tension between the north and the south. We have to keep in mind that the biblical kingdom of Israel was comprised of 12 tribes, but the king came from the tribe of Judah, and Jerusalem sat on Judah's tribal border, which could be viewed by the other tribes as unfair. A wise king would have had to be especially aware of the sensitivities of the other tribes. Following the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam became king, and in response to the political situation, went up north to the city of Shechem to have himself crowned. At this time, the northern tribes sent a delegation to tell the king their complaints. And the northern tribes consisted of the 10 tribes. Chief among them was the toll that King Solomon's building projects, the temple in Jerusalem, his palaces, etc., had taken on the people in terms of taxes and forced labor. The northern tribes, in fact, asked the king for a tax cut. Rehoboam considered waging war, but the prophet Shemaiah warned him against it, telling him that he could not possibly win, as this rending of the nation had been brought about by God. Remember, God told Solomon that this would happen. While the immediate cause of the split was the weakness and bad judgment of Rehoboam, the prime cause was rooted in idolatry of Solomon's wives, which the king had failed to stop. The split was clearly bad news for many reasons, both spiritual and geopolitical. The once strong, unified nation was now a weak, divided nation, and was easy prey to the empires of Egypt, Assyria, and later Babylon. King Rehoboam consulted his advisors. The elders who had served under Solomon told him to ease up on the people. Speak to them gently, and they will be your servants forever. But the younger upstarts advised him to show the people who's boss. Rehoboam took the latter advice and announced, "If you think my father was tough on you, just watch me. I'm going to be even tougher." Big mistake. Rehoboam forgot that even God had called the Jews a stiff-necked people. Jews were stubborn. In response to Rehoboam's arrogance in the year 796 BCE, the northern tribes seceded, creating a new kingdom called Israel. Rehoboam was left with just the southern part of the country in Jerusalem. His kingdom was called Judah. The terminology we use today, Judah and Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, has its origins in the split of the country after Solomon's death. So again, this is where in the New Testament, when you read about the Samaritans, they were really descendants of the 10 tribes, but were mixed among, other nationalities as well. And they, there was always animosity going forward between the two of them. Rehoboam considered waging war again, but the prophet, I'm sorry, this is a duplication here. Sorry about that. King Jeroboam, the king of the northern country of Israel, was Jeroboam ben Nebat. So here, Rehoboam was the king of Judah, the southern tribes. King Jeroboam was king of the northern 10 tribes, or which is known also as Ephraim, because Ephraim was the largest of all the northern tribes. He was a great man, a great leader, and a great scholar who once stood up to King Solomon. But unfortunately, the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, proved true. Soon Jeroboam was worrying less about leading the people and more about hanging onto his throne. Jeroboam saw that the Jewish people in the north were still very strongly connected to Jerusalem. After all, that was where the temple stood with its Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant. That was where the presence of God was most strongly felt. On the 3 big festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the people continued to stream to Jerusalem. He saw this commonality with the South could bring about a reunification, in which case he would no longer be king. So again, The northern tribes are trying to reunite. They still, again, were attached to Jerusalem. Jeroboam was jealous of this. He didn't want to see this. He wanted them to be under his power and his authority. He did not want them reconnected with Jerusalem. Once you open the door to idolatry by introducing alternative sites and alternative modes of worship, it means trouble. And there began a terrible period in Jewish history. In the next 220 years after Jeroboam, there were 19 different kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, all bad, but some worse than others. They were idolaters, corrupt and evil, and they led the Jewish people into idolatry. In fact, they set up their own temple, their own form of worship, separate from Judah and Jerusalem, where God had again placed his name. As we know, if the Jews don't get their act together spiritually, they're going to have their act together physically either. So we see a time period of great political instability and palace intrigue when kings came and went, and the succession was usually very bloody. So here you see the split between the two. Again, Judah always, retained, Jerusalem, because that was Hamakom, the place that God placed his name. And because of his covenant with David, Judah would remain in covenant, even though we'll see that both of the tribes end up going into being sent out of the land. And then we have the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes made up of Israel and in the area of Samaria. Rehoboam, King Solomon's son, and this is Joseph Telushkin, successor, has 3 bad traits. Again, he is greedy, arrogant, and a fool. This devastating combination causes the Jewish kingdom to split in two. So again, we see that, again, he's allowing the flesh, he could have walked in the wisdom of his father. He could have made better choices, but he listened to the wrong people, and again, caused a problem with the kingdom. I'm just going to skip those two because I've already said it. Rehoboam's first instinct, again, is to attack the 10 tribes and compel them to return to his kingdom. But realizing the odds are against him, he backs off. Again, he's outnumbered, 10 tribes to his one, and also Benjamin was also a part of Judah, and it was with Judah and half the Levites. Each state maintains its own royal house. The 10 tribes of Israel survive until 722 BCE, when they are defeated and destroyed by Assyria. The tiny state of Judah lasts until Babylon destroys it in 586 BCE. So about 200 years later. Much of this tragedy might have been averted had the wise King Solomon transmitted some of his wisdom to a singularly unwise son. So, I'm sure too, he was probably influenced by some of the paganism that was going on around there, the wealth that they had. Again, he became arrogant and prideful. In the case of King Ahab, now Ahab and Jezebel, we see this in 1 Kings 16:29 to 22:40. He's a very wicked king, and his wife, of course, everybody knows Jezebel. If you're an evil woman, you're referred to as Jezebel. Again, she was non-Jewish. She was a pagan queen and had a lot of influence over her husband. In the case of King Ahab and his non-Jewish queen Jezebel, we see again, as in the case of David and Bathsheba, how violation of the 10th commandment, you shall not covet, can lead to far more serious sins. Ahab, a king of the 10 northern tribes, covets a vineyard adjoining the royal lands. The owner, a man named Naboth, refuses to sell him the plot. The land has been in his family since the Israelites entered Palestine, and has no desire to dispose of so precious a family possession. Ahab falls into depression until Jezebel, the daughter of a Phoenician king of Sidon, and a woman totally unrestrained by biblical morality, tells him, "Be cheerful, I will get the vineyard of Naboth for you." She arranges for 2 false witnesses to testify that they heard Naboth publicly revile both God and king. Not only is this a capital crime, but the property of the people convicted of treason also is confiscated by the king. This is Joseph Telushkin. What started with an act of coveting has now led to violation of the commandments against bearing false witness, stealing, and murder. Within days, Navot is executed, and the king joyfully goes to possess his new field. But the Lord has already informed the prophet Elijah of the royal couple's evil doings. Go down and confront King Ahab in Navot's vineyard. God instructs Elijah, say to him, thus says the Lord, have you murdered and also inherited? Elijah waits for Ahab at the field, delivers God's message, and prophesies the downfall of Ahab and the royal family. He concludes with the prophecy that dogs shall devour the body of Jezebel in Naboth's stolen vineyard. Although Ahab's reign is very successful in both economic and military spheres, the only detail that matters to the Bible is that there was never anyone like Ahab who committed himself to doing what was displeasing to the Lord at the instigation of his wife, Jezebel. Indeed, the couple became the biblical prototype of an evil king and queen. In addition to instigating the murder of Naboth, Jezebel suppresses the worship of God and imports hundreds of idolatrous priests into Israel. Her influence is pervasive and long-lived. Two of her sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram, become kings of Israel, while her daughter Athaliah becomes the queen of Judah. 2 Kings 8:18. Jezebel's downfall. Along with the rest of her family comes in a coup d'etat by the religious reformer Jehu. Once she realizes that Jehu's revolt has succeeded, Jezebel meets her death with characteristic audacity. Standing inside a building located on Naboth's vineyard, she paints her eyes, arranges her hair, then taunts Jehu from the window. Is all well, murderer? The rebel leader sends in troops to throw her out the window, and she dies immediately. When the soldiers come back some hours later to bury her, all they found are her skull, feet, and hands. It's just as the Lord spoke through his servant Elijah. Jehu observes, the dog shall devour the flesh of Jezebel in the field in Naboth of Jezreel. 2 Kings 9:36. Again, Joseph Teluskin. And here, just to end, these are two charts of, again, the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. Judah had a mix of good kings and bad kings. Again, here we see that, again, Rehoboam, I'm just going to go through the list, was considered bad. He died. Abijam was again followed by another bad king. Asa was good. He also died. Of course, they all eventually died, but some naturally and some not naturally. Jehoram was another bad king, stricken by God in his bowels. Ahaziah was bad. He was murdered by Jehu. Athaliah, bad, murdered by, she was, again, the mother or the daughter of Jezebel, murdered by army. Joash was a good king, murdered by servants. Amaziah was a good king, murdered by court members. Azariah was a good king, stricken, but was stricken by God with leprosy. Jotham was good. Again, all these died. Ahaz, bad. Hezekiah, good. Remember, probably most people are familiar with the story of Hezekiah, where God granted him 15, he repented before God, and God granted him 15 more years of life. Manasseh was bad. Ammon was bad, murdered by servants. Josiah was good, who was wounded in battle. Jehoahaz was bad, disposed to Egypt. Jehoiakim was bad, died in the Babylonian siege. Jehoiakim was his son, was also bad, disposed to Babylon, and Zedekiah, bad, disposed to Babylon. So again, they had, a mix of good and bad, probably more good than bad rulers, during this time of the split. Some of them, again, their reigns weren't very long. You see 17 years, 3 years, 41, 25, 8. Azariah 1, so some of them, actually Manasseh 55 years, Joash 40 years, so some of them longer than others, but the majority didn't reign, super long. These are the kings of Israel, the northern tribes, and they're pretty much all bad. When you read First Kings, you'll see, okay, then Jehoram became king and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And each one of these, their heritage was, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. As you're reading through, which is very interesting reading the history of these kings in First and Second Kings. Again, God states that, says this one, did righteousness, but when, again, they did evil, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So again, the northern tribes they didn't have any good kings who followed God. And again, to be considered a good king, you were one that followed the Torah, walked in obedience to God and did what God said. Again, the bad kings are one who involved paganism and rejected the Torah, rejected God's teachings and instructions. And again, you can see how short most of their reigns were. Jeroboam II, he actually reigned probably the longest of all of these kings. But I wanted to add these charts to you because and here's all the scriptures. And again, you can see how all these men died, either stricken by God, murdered by somebody, or died in battle, or their life was cut short. Again, many of them murdered by somebody else. Some were exiled to Assyria, and the Assyrians were very vicious warriors. In fact, they were terrorists. When they would take over a kingdom, they would chop off the heads of all the people and pile them upon, at the gates of the city, and let them know, if you don't submit to us, this is what you can expect. They were very, unmerciful, very evil. I mean, Babylon, they weren't much better, but because God determined that, and we're going to get into that later, that Judah would only be 70 years in Babylon. Again, God gave them favor even in Babylon so that they could build houses, they could live in somewhat peace. Because of his covenant with David, because of his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because the Messiah would come through the tribe of Judah. God always had a remnant within Judah that was preserved, again, to this day, but because through Judah would come Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Hallelujah. So I'm just going to end here.